girlfriends, family, mentors, people who care about what happens, and reach a set of agreements about how the responsible party can make things as right as possible. Those agreements include things you'd expect, like do community service, pay restitution, go to school, get a job, stay drug-free. They include things you might not expect, like a harmed and responsible party meeting each other's children. So the person who was robbed at gunpoint and really believed he might lose his life said to the young man who robbed him, "I want you to meet the children whose father you almost took from them that night with your gun. And I believe today in the father you can be to your baby girl, and I want to say that to her face." Two young men who almost took each other's lives in East New York, doing a speaking tour about the impact of cycles of violence on their lives, talking about how the losses they survived formed the basis for the harm they went on to cause, and how that shaped their sense of accountability for it. A case in which someone taught self-defense techniques to the same person he had mugged and harmed a year and a bit earlier. I should say that any of the stories I tell you, I have the permission of the people whose lives they describe to tell. And if you've heard me talk before, you'll hear me tell them in the exact same way. I'm sorry if that bores you. You can check your phones or whatever you need to do in that time. But I do that because stories are really important and people's agency are important. Agreements are reached for the next year or so. The responsible party works to fulfill them. They see us 3 days a week. At the first part, they see us 5 days a week. Throughout this time, they go through a really intensive violence intervention curriculum we've developed. We are at war with the normalization of violence, and we know that doing that includes cultivating people's sense of accountability, the sense of the impact of their actions, and also an understanding of where their formative experience of violence came from and what they can do to transform that. We know for all of us, our behavior is grounded in our expectations and experiences and values and beliefs. And we believe that in a process of interrogating those expectations, experiences, values, and beliefs, that we can behave differently. We know that about all of us, and we know it to be particularly true about violence, and we see that in our practice. At the end of that 15-month period for the responsible person, if they're successful, the plea is vacated, the felony charges against them are dismissed, and they're sentenced to a conditional discharge on a misdemeanor. And for those same 15 months, we provide wraparound services to the victims of those crimes, help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And so in that context, I'll talk to you, and I'm looking at the time, not at cat pictures. I'll talk to you about what I think are some kind of 4 core myths that common justice kind of helps demonstrate how they're untrue and is also built in our realization that they're not true. And the first is that we as a country know who victims are. So we tell a story in this country that is a very, very old story, as old as this criminal justice system, that the people most likely to be hurt are white women. The person most likely to be robbed or assaulted in the United States is a man of color. That is not to say that white women aren't hurt and aren't disproportionately hurt by some, that women aren't disproportionately hurt by some crimes. I certainly know that to be true. But when we look at crimes of violence, young men of color are hands down the people most likely to be hurt. A young man of color is 10.5 times more likely than I am to be assaulted by a stranger. And it's still faces like mine on victim service posters and people like me in the vast majority of victim serving agencies. We recently issued an issue brief about this called The Other Side of Harm that you can find on the Vera Institute website if you're interested, about the disproportionate rates at which young men of color are hurt and our profound failure as a country to in any way tend to their pain equitably. When I am hurt, I can get things that help me come through that pain. That's of enormous value. I deserve that. Even with that, my healing will be one of the hardest things I ever do. I should have those things, so should everybody else. And we fail to do it. It also means that the range of voices we listen to when we talk about what victims want and need is artificially small. We have an artificially monolithic understanding of what victims want. So fewer than 2% of victims get help when they've been hurt. So when we say victims want, victims need, victims like, 2% is a really poor sample size. I don't have to work at the Vera Institute of Justice to know that that's true. I can say that with my master's degree in poetry. That if I ask 2 out of 100 people what they want and then generalize about it, and those 2% are not randomly selected, because it's not like who gets treated well by the police, taken seriously by the prosecutor, referred to services, goes to those services and finds those services to be useful. It's not as though that narrowing isn't inflected profoundly by issues, particularly of race. So we don't know who victims are, or they're not who we pretend they are. If you look at every episode of Law & Order, for example, you will find one where the victim is a man of color. It is a story about homicide victims in New York City. The first 27 people to be killed in the city this year were men of color. The 28th was a woman of color. We do not tell the story accurately about who's been hurt. The myth is that we know what victims want, and specifically that what they want is incarceration. Of course, if we get the first one wrong and we're only talking to a tiny fraction of victims and we're only talking to them in a specific way, there's no way we can answer that second question right. But what we know at Common Justice is what people want is not, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. What we want exists in the context of a range of options. Like when you go to a restaurant, you read the menu for a reason, right? You don't just sit down and go, what do I feel like today? And at the pizza spot, be like, I would like a burger, right? You pay attention to what's available to you. At Common Justice, every one of the victims we work with, we only take cases with victims' consent. Every one of the victims we work with reported it to the police, participated in grand jury. So these are not a bunch of like abolitionists, right? And 90% of the victims we've spoken to choose Common Justice over the incarceration of the person who harmed them. 90%. So that's in a context of a culture that tells us incarceration is the only solution, of a punitive culture, of a culture where they have no one in their lives who's been through a restorative justice process or know what it is with no reference point. Even in that context, 90% of people choose this. And so we know if you say, do you want something or nothing, people will say they want something. When we have been hurt, nothing is not an option, right? The world needs to be different. I don't live the same way. I don't work the same way. I don't love the same way. Something or nothing. I want something. What we find is that if instead of just asking that, we also ask, do you want this or that the vast majority of people want this. And the best way I've been able to compare it is if you imagine a sort of crappy hamburger spot in the middle of the desert with nothing for 100 miles, with a line out the door, and then you looked at that and said, these are, Americans love burgers, and this is the best burger stand, right? You'd be making a poor judgment, right? It's the same thing we do with incarceration and victims in this country. Incarceration heals people. For some people, incarceration delivers a sense of justice. For some, it delivers a temporary sense of or reality of safety, though that is notably temporary. But it does not for anyone fully deliver them the healing they deserve. And we rely on it as our sole mechanism to ensure justice, safety, and healing for victims, even though there is very little evidence of its ability to deliver any of those three things. We owe victims better than a totally unproven intervention to meet their most serious pain. We believe victims deserve a response to their harm that actually works. We believe they deserve justice, they deserve safety, right? And they deserve to be supported to heal. And then the last myth is the idea that we don't know what to do. And that myth is particularly strong when it comes to cases of serious violence. It's fostered even within the restorative justice community that often acts as though the tools available to us only can go a certain distance. And we do know what to do. And so I will say first that at Common Justice, while our numbers are small, fewer than 10% of our responsible parties have been terminated for new crimes. That's true even though we're brand new, that there were no other models to look to, that we've been learning as we go. Even in that context, we produce those kinds of outcomes. We expect those to only improve. But I also would say, and this is really a challenge primarily to the white folks in this room, is that as white people, we're diverted all the time. Like all of us know, like when we think about detention in elementary school, we think about staying after school and not going to a juvenile jail. Like that's what the word detention means to us, right? We understand what it's like for someone to see us as fully human people who have made a serious mistake and to find everything available to them to do something other than destroy our lives. And so as people who have experienced that, and each one of us has, some in really extreme degrees of being let go for crimes for which other people were sentenced harshly, and some just in the daily practice of being treated in ways that uplift our humanity. As people who have had that experience, I believe we have a particular responsibility to push back against the myth that nothing else is possible, because our success and our well-being and our livelihood is living proof that it is. I have 15 seconds to speak.
Panel, and I could talk about this for ages, so I'm going to need the timekeeper. So at Probation, we have taken on infusing restorative justice, restorative principles, let's call it that, throughout our entire existence. And so if there's one thing I want to make sure I do before my time is up, is that. And so what we've done so far is that we have infused it in individual work with our clients, in group work with our clients, in our management, I run my senior leadership team meetings in a restorative circle, and in program design and in case conferencing. So let me talk a little bit about more of the specifics, because like, for example, in family court, the Department of Probation has the unique opportunity to make that diversion decision of whether an arrested young person, that case will be put through the system and sent to the prosecutor's office, or will be diverted from court to an alternative process. And so right now what we're doing is that even though we don't have the resources to have a restorative justice team for formal conferencing with the harmed party, unfortunately not yet, but we'll get there. We do have partners here who help us in that regard. That every young person whose case gets diverted has a restorative interview, what we call a restorative interview. And the family, we sort of treat the family as the harmed party in many ways. So they go through the questions of what happened, because in that process, anything they say about what they did cannot be used against them, even if the case ends up in court. Okay, so we have a unique opportunity to really be able to ask from a legal point of view what happened without a lot of repercussions for the young person. And so they're asked what happened, what were you thinking about at the time, who's been affected by it, what have you thought about sins, how people have been affected, et cetera, right? And eventually, what needs to happen so that you're not in this position again, right? And so, why we do this is that we truly believe that this is a learning moment for young people, and restorative justice allows for that to happen. Because part of the issue that we have with the young people, most of whom are young people of color, and in our adult system, older young men of color, the average age of the probation client in adult court is about 30 years old, so, and so we're talking about 28,000 people on probation in adult court, and about 2,500 in family court, although we process every case of every arrest in the juvenile field, which ends up being about 7,000 or 8,000 at this point. So the young people, it's a process that doesn't judge, that doesn't have to, we don't have to get into whether they actually did it or not, or whether they're lying or not, because the issue is that you're here, you have an opportunity to learn about what happened, and really, when you're absorbing how you've impacted other people, and obviously this is the choir here, I'm sure, that has a profound impact on them, right? And although it is not, we don't have the data yet to really see how this will, it correlates to whether kids come back or not. We've seen anecdotally that it improves the communication with the family, because the parents for the first time are hearing certain things from the young people. The young people are hearing from the parents, who are being asked what's been the hardest thing for you, right? Because the parents have been experiencing a lot of strife at home usually by the time a young person gets arrested, right? And what do you need, right? Our goal is to move.
Hi again, I am Erica Sasson. I'm from the Center for Court Innovation. And a number of years ago we started researching this practice called peacemaking, which is practiced in Native American communities really around the country and other countries as well. And Mika did a great survey of who's in the room. I'm wondering if there's anyone, any First Nations, any Native Americans in the room? Nope. Okay. Hello. Nice to see you. And I want to talk a little bit about that aspect. I think that we've gotten an amazing introduction as to what the restorative principles can do. And one thing that I always hope to bring to the table is to bring the Native American tradition and to honor that. So that's what I'd like to talk about. And in the spirit of peacemaking, we often, we really bring ourselves to the table when we're doing peacemaking. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm from Canada. I am a former prosecutor, and not ashamed, I don't know what to say. And I'm a mom and a stepmom and a sister and a cousin, and these are some of the things that animate my work. And it's and my family's originally from the Middle East, and both sides were at different times refugees. And these are all stories of where I'm from that matter to me, and that are things that come out in peacemaking and help other people who are in conflict figure out, where are you from and what's your story. And the more we can figure those things out, sometimes that really helps plan the next steps. So I cut my teeth prosecuting in Canada, and it taught me a lot about the myths of our system, as Danielle talked about. And before I finish, I'm so excited to hear from you that this is happening in the mainstream this way. So I can't go on without just saying that was very exciting. But when I was prosecuting, I had a lot of, not just my size was an issue, but the fact that when we were talking about something that happened, my back would be turned to the person that I would be talking about. So I'd say, Mr. So-and-so did this, 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 and this, and this, and I wasn't making eye contact. They were standing behind me in a box. And then I would come up with some, magical number of time that should be spent in jail, and that would be communicated to the person in front of me, who looked somewhat like the people on the walls, and then that would be imposed, and I would go on with my day. And it was really painful to practice in that way, to not see the person that I'm talking about, to not hear their story, to not connect. And I think it's painful for the people who are practicing, and I can't speak to how painful it might be for the people going through it. But I do think it's painful for the people practicing as well. What did we learn in that system? We talk a lot about what happened in the past. We adjudicate that. We're very smart and professional, and we tend to ostracize and separate people. So you did something wrong, and now you should be alone. And what you were saying about connection and isolation, that I just don't see how you're going to not make that same mistake again, or not do that harm again, if you're even less connected than you were when you came through the store, and you're even more alone and have less tools at your disposal. So that's kind of some of the things that I learned in just my own practice, and then I joined the Center for Court Innovation, and we were working a lot with Native communities around the country and hearing a lot about this talk of peacemaking. And we realized that would be something we really wanted to try in the Western court system. And it was really important to share all the best practices that we had at the Center for Court Innovation with Native communities, and say, and we're here to learn from what your best practices are, and see if we can bring those back into Red Hook. So that's what we did. We spent many years studying and hearing from incredible Native peacemakers, and they're from communities in the Navajo Nation, and up in Alaska, and in the West Coast, and just really all over the country. And we just made connections with people in your neck of the woods, sir, in the Six Nations as well, who have been doing this for a really long time. And one of the things that I really like to talk about is the fact that this has been around for a really long time, and to acknowledge that and to recognize those leaders and in Native communities. So what we did, and again, I have 0 sense of time, and that's part of peacemaking, is we did a training for our peacemakers. Our peacemakers are, and this is again really kind of particular to our work, is they're people from the community that we serve. They have all different, there's some in the audience. They're from all different backgrounds, all different educational backgrounds. You really bring yourself to peacemaking. It's not about the fact that I'm an attorney. I never ever talk about that if I'm in a peacemaking session. The training took about 3 months, and we trained our peacemakers to learn how to share about themselves in a way that would inspire the participant to also share about themselves. And it's really the principle of equality in the circle, And it's, I have to say that it's helped me peacemaking, because when I can share my own vulnerability, it's less scary to do something wrong in the future, because you know that you can fix it, and that we're all doing good and bad all the time. And that realization has been, I think, really beneficial. And it helps the participants say, okay, well, you messed up too, and now I can tell you how I messed up and why I messed up. And it takes many hours, and it takes really, it's hard, and the work is really hard, if nothing else. But so we train our peacemakers to share of themselves, to elicit that from our participants, so that they can feel connected, they can make real connections with the peacemakers in the circle, they can relate to one another, and then hopefully come to consensus, because one of the things I think that we learn in the conventional system is that you're not going to learn accountability by somebody telling you what the answer is for what you did. You've really got to figure it out yourself if you're going to make a change. If you're just going to go on to business as usual, carry on, do what you want to do. But if you want to make a change, and if we want to help people inspire change, we really have to give them the chance to come to that conclusion themselves. So that's something that we really focus on. And I think we've talked about a lot of what that means about healing. It is about connection. It is about the person doing the work. It is about the harmed party, and I really appreciate your lingo on this front. Is to really bring people together so that they can come to their own conclusions about what it means to be a victim, what it means to want something from somebody else, and to figure that out themselves and move on. So one of the major differences that we see in the conventional system is a focus on future behavior. We're not going to sit around and talk about what happened in the past. You might want to talk about it a little bit, but we really try to reorient the circle towards talking about what you're going to do next time, how you want to relate to that person in the future, what you want out of this relationship so that you can heal the relationship. I want to talk about so many things, but I'll say that we do some ceremony in our practice. It comes from, again, our Native mentors who have taught us about that, and it might be a moment of silence, it might be some way of just changing the vibe in the room and to say this is something different. And we really wanted to, as much as we adapted our program to our Red Hook community, we wanted to remember our roots from the people who have taught us. And I just want to say that one of the best things about it is the way that people who've been through our program, and we don't do as serious offenses the way Danielle does, but we do a lot of assaults, and they're really serious with people in them. And the way that the criminal justice system categorizes what is serious and what is not serious is not necessarily reflective in people's realities. But what has been inspiring to me is sometimes the extent that a peacemaker in our program will share of themselves and will care and will connect and will look out for that person in the community afterwards. That's been really inspiring. We've had peacemakers taking young people to events or helping them get a tie or helping them do their resume and just going that extra distance, and that's been really inspiring. And then some of our participants calling us a few months down the road and saying, you know, I'm at my new job, you told me to worry about my triggers, and someone just called me, we had a Muslim woman calling me saying, you know, someone just called me a towel head, and I don't know what to do, I'm so angry. And he said, but you're doing it, you just called me, you're not in the fight, and like we're there, you know, and having that connection sustain has been, I think, what sustains our program and our gratitude. So if I can just say my gratitude to my Navajo mentors and my mentors from Alaska, and thank you for having me.
McCann from the New York Peace Institute.
Hello. Again, Carrie McCann, New York Peace Institute. Thank you all, and Kamika. I feel incredibly honored to be on a panel with such incredible people. And it's great, and I can't wait to hear the other half of what's going on down there. I'm from the New York Peace Institute, and we provide conflict resolution and mediation services across so many different areas. So just very briefly who we are. So we do civil court mediation and special education mediation and landlord-tenant issues and noisy neighbors. We work in schools. But what I'm going to talk to you most about today is about our work with the criminal justice system. So we work very closely with the Brooklyn DA's office and also with probation and with the Corporation Council and Family Courts. We receive cases from all of these places. And we use different processes depending on kind of what the situation is. So to see what the issue is, a bulk of our cases are assaults, our vandalism, our theft, and most of the time the cases that we work with, people already have an existing relationship. And we do this awesome thing with the Brooklyn DA's office and a lot of our other partners, that they send us the case, and the parties actually get to decide what's going to happen with that case. So Danielle said earlier that when we think of justice and when we think of what people want in the criminal justice system, it's incarceration. But 90% of the people who go through one of our processes want to dismiss the case, which I think is a huge number when you're thinking about what actually happens and what people actually want to happen. So people who come through our door through that process get to decide what happens and figure out how they want to make it better. All of our processes, like most of these, are voluntary and are confidential. So we're also not reporting back to the court exactly what people say, which I think parties really like and is very unique to a lot of what happens. So I want to, like everyone, tell you a story because I think that's the best way to really talk about the impact of restorative practices. And I'm going to tell you a story about young people, and I know we've talked a lot about young people, but I want to just say that this isn't something that only happens with young people. Restorative practices can be used with people of any ages and any type of crime. It's not just, misdemeanor crimes or the low-level crimes, which is easier for people to understand, but it can also be used with the more serious crimes and with adults. But my story today is about young people, and we got a call from a school who said, I don't know what to do. We had 6 girls get in a huge fight on the subway platform. They were all arrested, and now 4 of them were arrested. And now these 4 girls that have been arrested, so they're in the criminal justice system, and have also been suspended, so they're going through that punitive process as well, are now all coming back to school. And we've tried to do mediation to prevent this. We've done everything that we can to try to work out this issue, and what we're doing isn't working. So they called us, and what we did was called not only the parties, but we got in touch with all of their attorneys. So not only did we get this case from the school, we also got it from the criminal justice system, so we could handle both the interpersonal issue and the issue that was going through the justice system. They were 16, so they were in the adult criminal justice system. They weren't in probation or family court. So we got the case. We did a lot of prep work with everyone before we brought them into the room together. We had all of the girls, 4 girls who jumped 1 girl, and then the other kind of instigator also kind of involved. And the principal and the assistant principal, as well as the support people for the girls. And that was mothers and grandmothers and a father and an aunt, and all different kinds of people that support our young people. So we bring all of these people together and go through those questions, the what happened, the impact of what happened, and how are we going to make it better. And I won't tell you every little detail, even though I want to, because it's probably not as interesting to you. And I could go on for probably 20 minutes telling this only story. But the point that I want to emphasize is that in this particular conference and in this particular situation, the girl who got jumped had actually instigated a lot of the situation, and nobody knew that until they came together as a group. None of the parents, none of the faculty knew that this young woman was on Facebook saying, go ahead, come at me. Go ahead, I'm ready for this. So that came out, and that kind of shifted the thinking about what was really going on. It was clear that this was a back and forth. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. But in this situation it was. 2 other really great things happened. And this is, Commissioner Bermudez was talking about those moments, those shifts. And there were 2 in this conference. The first was when the principal had said, he tried as much as he could to help the girls with this situation, but he hadn't talked about how he'd been impacted. And when he looked at them and said, I'm so incredibly hurt, and you hurt my feelings, and I feel really upset because you sat there and you looked at me and you told me everything was fine, and then the next day you jumped her. And he was able to say that how he was personally impacted and how hurt he was, and when the girls saw him kind of open up and be vulnerable in a way that he hadn't been, there was a shift in the room. And the other shift in the room happened when the young lady that was jumped brought her aunt, who was 24, so she was young. And the aunt said, I went to the school. Your principal now is one of my teachers. I went to that subway platform. I know what you guys are dealing with, and it is not worth it. You all are 16. You're going to be going to college soon. You better be going to college soon. And this situation is not worth it. Like, when you look at this 2 years down the line, you're not going to be friends with these people, and this will not matter. And what are you guys going to do to make it better? So a lot of times, people decide, hey, let's be friends again. That didn't happen in this case. They didn't want to be friends again, but what they did agree to was to stop bumping each other in the hallways and to stop looking at each other in a way that's provoking each other, and to really say that this situation is squashed and this situation is over. And that was really powerful for them to say that to each other's face, and for none of them to be afraid either of retaliation or something like this happening again when they walk into school the next day after their long suspension. And the other thing that happened was, because we got this case, we were able to get the case from the criminal justice system as well. They said they wanted the case to be dismissed. They didn't want this to go through with that, and the attorneys and the judge upheld that agreement amongst the girls. They said, you all wanted this, you figured it out, and we're not going to pursue this any further in the justice system. So it's pretty incredible, and it's really, I think one of the things we were going to talk about today was what we want to see happen in the future. And one of the things I would love to see happen is to have a more, or less, integrated justice system in school. So if a young person gets arrested in school, that means they're not only having that suspension, but they're having some other kind of criminal justice process, and they often overlap and affect each other in really harmful ways. And to be able to figure out a way to use restorative justice in that situation so that there's not all these punitive systems that they're having to go through, and there's no healing and no figuring out what the underlying issue is, and the issues just keep happening, and as we know, it cycles, and then they end up further into the justice system. So I think one of my wishes, and what I hope that we at the New York Peace Institute are helping to do, is to kind of bridge that gap and help reduce the people going through both of those systems through the different processes that we have. I'm not going to go into all the stuff that we do in schools, but if you're interested, come up to me afterwards, and I'm happy to talk more about that.
Erica Ayala. I work for the Children's Defense Fund, where we look to provide a healthy start, a head start, a safe start, a fair start, and a moral start for all children in America, and successful passage into adulthood with the help of caring families and communities. And I think that's really important in the work that we do when it comes to restorative practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about restorative practice. I use the International Institute of Restorative Practice language as opposed to restorative justice, which I'll explain a little bit. But first, I'd like everyone to stand up. All right, so in the spirit of stories, I want to tell you a story about a man named Jomo Kenyatta. Jomo Kenyatta was a political prisoner in his home country of Kenya. And after being released from prison, he took the Mandela track and became the leader of his country. And so he could have said so many things about how he was treated in prison and what his plans were for the people who treated him poorly prior to and then while he was in prison. But instead, he said one word, and he said it 3 times. And he asked everyone who was there for his speech to say those words along with him, the third and last being the loudest. And the word that he asked everyone to say is Harambe. Now, Harambe is a Kiswahili word which means let's pull together. So we're going to do that. We're going to bring the spirit of Jomo Kenyatta into this room. So again, the word is Harambe. We're going to say it 3 times, the third being the loudest, and then we're going to put our fist in. All right? Everyone ready? Stretch it out if you need to. Go. Okay. Harambe!
Harambe! Harambe!
Okay, good job, good job. Take a seat. Take a seat. All right. Load off your feet. All right. So, in your spare time, when you just want to know all about me, in my bio you might see a program called the Freedom Schools. The Children's Defense Fund. Okay, I see you. Okay, single family, all right. I love it when that happens. So the Freedom Schools, I started with the Children's Defense Fund when I was in college as a servant leader intern. And the story of Jomo Kenyatta and Harambe is a story that we share at the Freedom Schools. And even before I knew what restorative justice and restorative practice was, I was learning a lot of the foundation and the building blocks to that. And so at the Children's Defense Fund, what I want to pull out are some of the ways that we proactively integrate restorative practice. And one of those is by setting the tone. So doing a Harambe every morning with our students. Freedom Schools is a program that is to foster a love for reading and promote literacy. We also engage parents and communities in social action, in conflict resolution. And we do that because we create a safe space. So we've heard a lot about that already, creating safe spaces, being able to have spaces where we're communing. All of our students sit in a circle, which is another restorative practice. So these are things that are already in the community and that we try to really build because we know that these work when it comes to creating open dialogue, creating safe spaces, and creating a trusting community. So that's one of the things that we do at Freedom Schools that I wanted to uplift. But I'm going to talk mostly about the work that we do at the Children's Defense Fund New York, in particular with the School Safety Division of the New York Police Department. So exciting. So at the end of the bio packet, I believe, the Safety Division, those are the uniformed peacekeepers in the schools. So somewhere at the end of the 90s, I believe, the School Safety Division went from being a part of the Board of Education, the old Board of Education, to the New York Police Department. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term the school-to-prison pipeline and zero-tolerance policies. And so when that shift from the Board of Education to the NYPD took place, we saw a lot of things start to happen where in New York City public schools in particular, we were seeing a lot of that school-to-prison pipeline and zero-tolerance policies really impacting students. And so the way that the Children's Defense Fund New York came into this work is that we have partners through the Dignity in Schools New York campaign. And we were looking at zero-tolerance policies, looking at school-to-prison pipeline. And we were working with a parent group in the Bronx who was very upset to find out that almost half of the arrests, summonses, and suspensions at the end of the 2011-2012 school year were from the Bronx. And it's kind of, what's up with that? Why are we seeing these numbers? And so they decided to have a public hearing. And they called the New York Police Department School Safety Division, and they called the DOE, Department of Education, Office of School Safety, Office of Safety and Development, OSYD, to this public hearing. And they said, you know what, we're not happy with these numbers. And we could, they had a Jomo Kenyatta moment, if you will. They could have went, this and that, why are you arresting my children? They could have done that. And some people do that, and that's okay. But instead they said, we want to be a part of the solution. And we want you to help us to be a part of the solution. And we want to help you to be a part of the solution. And so since then, we at the Bronx School Justice Work Group, we're advocates, parents, teachers, and then OSYD and the School Safety Division have been meeting monthly since 2012 to discuss the arrest summonses and suspensions, primarily in the Bronx. But from those conversations, we were able to do this training for school safety. And I'm going to point you to a few things. One, earlier we heard about, let me go back to my notes, make sure I'm saying this right. But there were some wonderful points that Danielle brought up, such as, the myth that we know who the victims are. And so in our workshop, you can see that we at the Children's Defense Fund talk about the cradle to prison pipeline. Something else that was mentioned is that a lot of what we see happening, particularly in schools and with young people, that then goes into the justice system, is not just between one person or another person. There are communities, there are people, there is history involved in every incident that we see, particularly ones that escalate to violence. So we might know that 4 people were jumped, but we never got to the heart of who
might have been an instigator. You're not getting those stories, if you will. So we break that down. What are some of the things that we're seeing in communities, and how are we, or how can we, and what are we willing to do to be responsible for taking ownership of being a part of the solution? So that's one part of our workshop. Then also, we heard about knowing what the victims want, or what's really going on. And honestly, as an advocate, I'll say, I'll put this on me. I went into this work assuming that all safety agents just wanted to arrest children, they wanted to give them summonses and all this stuff. That's not the case. They are feeling very hurt and very harmed by what we're seeing happening in the schools. And so having that conversation really opened us up to be able to not only provide for students, but to provide for the agents as well, and figure out who we need to have these conversations with. Other things that we heard, and one of the myths that hopefully we'll be busting, if you will, is that incarceration heals people. Well, that's the same thing as an arrest, a summons, or a suspension. So you'll see that we talk about the collateral consequences, and how sometimes when you have to appear before a summons, we think that is too punitive, but also it's a little, if you will, just a tap on the wrist. It's not really dealing with the issue. So the Freedom Schools program, that's where we integrate a lot of the proactive approaches, but specifically wanted to talk about the work that we do in schools with the School Safety Division. We've learned a lot. They've been very open to the process. We've started them off with the basics, which we see as the social discipline window, again, by the International Institute of Restorative Practice. Just figuring out, how are we approaching this situation? Are we closing off people? Are we being too punitive? Are we being too protective? We want to work in that with box that you'll see on the outline. We want to be supportive and uphold the expectation, but also hold people accountable for when they do not meet the expectation. And I'll go back to Freedom Schools again, and some of the things that we're trying to do with the School Safety Division also is that we're all expected to adhere by rules, dress code, this kind of thing. But wouldn't it be great if you had a say-so in what were the expectations that you were supposed to meet every day, rather than just finding out about them because you didn't meet the expectation? And so that's what we try to do. At Freedom Schools, we do a cooperation contract. With the work that we do with the School Safety Division, we've had to revamp our approach and really be able to hear what the School Safety Division is going through, so that we can have conversations with the students, with the teachers, all across the board to figure out how we can support them. Because if we're truly going to be advocates for community, if we're truly going to be advocates for children, then we need to be advocates for the advocates. And we need to figure out how we all work together rather than working in silos, and certainly we don't want to be working against one another and putting each other on the spot without having that understanding. So again, Harambe, let's pull together.
My name is Ruben Oskia, and I'll follow my sister's lead and just in peacemaking fashion and tell you a little bit about myself. I need to do this kind of just because this is my first week back at work. I just had my first child. So I was on paternity leave in December and still kind of getting my work chops back. But I'd say becoming a father and raising a kid in the South Bronx probably makes it even more imperative for me to work towards a world where restorative justice is the predominant philosophy, as opposed to a philosophy of punishment or a philosophy that doesn't address violence and doesn't address these sorts of things. Anyway, I am the founder and executive director of an organization called Community Connections for Youth. We're based in the South Bronx, and the mission of our organization is to develop community-driven alternatives to incarceration. And we've pretty much set ourselves up for the purpose of doing any and every alternative to putting kids through the justice system. Although more and more I'm kind of even questioning the language of our own mission statement that says alternatives to incarceration, because it kind of assumes that incarceration is the norm or the default. And the truth is there's been better ways for so long, but we really have a failure of the imagination to kind of think, well, if not the justice system, then what? But our main goal and our mission is to empower local communities opportunities to intervene when young people are getting in trouble in ways that restore young people to community, and specifically to do it with buy-in through the local community. So we really got started doing a couple of initiatives in the South Bronx. The first was something called South Bronx Community Connections, where we said we want to just take our backyard, which is the South Bronx neighborhood of Mott Haven, about a 1 square mile area, the 40th Police Precinct, Community District 1, and we said, what if we could get as many kids as possible who are arrested and are arrested, you know, for the first or second time, and just try to keep them out of the justice system altogether. We thought it was so important to keep them out of the justice system because so often once you're in the justice system, you're not necessarily getting penalized and getting deeper in because you're committing more crimes or worse and worse crimes, but because of these annoying violations of probation or non-compliance and these things where you know, people are kind of going, well, you're just not following our rules, and so we have to keep sanctioning you and pulling you deeper. And having done alternatives to incarceration in the past with kids who were on probation and had sentences, I just wanted to keep kids out of the justice system altogether. But knowing that there's so many incidences that happen every day where kids are being arrested and where kids are being detained, but we were able to convince, actually, it was the prosecutors at first in the Bronx, the family court prosecutors, Corporation Counsel, said if there was kids that you could send to us who you're just kind of tired of prosecuting, and right away they said, oh, school fights. So we just, you know, my attorneys are saying if I have to prosecute another school fight, I just don't want to do it because I'm prosecuting, again, these same stories, these kids who jumped another kid, and then by the time the trial comes around, they're friends again. They were friends before, they're friends after. Or these cases where it was the kid who got arrested who beat up one kid, but a week before the other kid had beat him up, and you know, it's like who's really the victim and who's the offender in these circumstances. But they were willing to send us those cases. And then what happened wonderfully as well was in the Department of Probation when Vinnie Chiral and Anna Bermudez came in and really shifted the culture of probation and said, let's use our power on the front end with diversion or adjustment just to keep a lot of cases out. Probation actually kind of took over in terms of being our top referral source because they had the first shot at the kids and started to refer a lot of these cases to us. And then it began to move backwards a little bit because one of the things that we saw that was so actually disturbing was when we started the program, it was maybe July of 2011, and we weren't getting any referrals. And we're kind of talking to the prosecutors and talking to the probation officers and saying, hey, where are referrals? And they say, oh, don't worry, they'll pick up again when school starts. Right? They'll actually probably pick up after the Jewish holidays, September, everything's fine. By October, kids will start getting arrested. Don't worry, you'll have tons of arrests after schools. And we said, oh my, how is it that being at school is almost the most likely factor for being arrested for a juvenile in New York? And what we saw was that at least half of the referrals that came to us were school-based assaults or incidences that had happened as a result of something happening in school. But we began to get those cases, and you know, and it was actually, as long as it was probation diverting them or the prosecutors diverting them, it was pretty easy to work with these kids. It was, you know, for the most part, they just needed positive community. We got them plugged into local neighborhood programs, got them mentors from the community, engaged their parents. But we started to see that so many of these cases are coming from schools and began to try to dig a little bit deeper into the way the cases were getting there. And we talked to the police, and you kind of even had this mixed reaction from the police, where some of the police were saying, yeah, you know, like you gotta arrest these kids or they just go on to worse things. And other police officers even saying, you know, I'm tired of arresting kids for school fights, but when the school calls us and says there's a victim, you know, what are we supposed to do? And then even going to certain schools and just kind of the schools kind of acknowledging sometimes, hey, this whole practice of arresting, suspending, and disciplining young people, it's not solving the violence because we get a kid arrested, we get them suspended, and then they might be showing up the next day at the campus anyway with 15 of their friends to jump somebody else, and that was one of those shifts or that breakthrough moments of kind of talking to the schools and where people who are going, no, we need accountability, we need consequences, we know all these things, and just kind of saying, well, how's that working out for you? Is it solving the culture of violence at your school? and then kind of going, no, it's not. Saying, well, maybe we can offer you a better way. And I'm actually not, I feel like I'm probably, of the people on this panel, probably one of the least experienced or knowledgeable about restorative justice. I've had some great training from people like Sujata Baliga on the West Coast, Rita Alfred, Cheryl Graves in Chicago. But we really kind of came to restorative justice believing it to be the solution in 2 minutes. Just because we saw, well, what, traditionally working with alternatives, we're trying to get a kid out of the justice system, we're trying to kind of free him from that whole oppressive, racist, punitive system, but there is real harm that is caused in communities. Young people do get jumped, they do get their stuff taken, they do, that there is violence, and how are we going to solve that at the community level? And so we've got to think about not just keeping young people out of the justice system, but building community between those who have been harmed. And I just want to make a quick, I was thinking about this, and this is what's really been my experience with restorative justice, and I hope this doesn't sound wrong, but I think actually restorative justice, it's kind of easy, it's kind of simple, and it's kind of natural. It's not that hard. It's kind of what people, once they unlearn the programming that they've had, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, this works. What's complicated and hard and difficult is getting systems to buy into the logic that the current punitive arrest and suspension and disciplinary practices are not necessary and the best way to deal with things.
Yeah.
And so we see so many examples of family members, young people, communities embracing this, learning how to work it out. The biggest challenge is people like in the DOE who are saying, no, if we don't have the suspension, everything is going to fall apart. And so I think the big work that needs to happen in New York City, right, is not so much, it is getting a whole bunch of people educated and trained and practicing this stuff, but there's a whole lot of work to be done because in most places you don't have a commissioner like Anna Bermudez who says, yes, restorative practices are the way to go. And she's the commissioner of probation, but probation intersects with the police, and it intersects with schools, and it intersects with the prosecutors, and we still don't have a unifying framework of something as an alternative to these punitive practices. The second thing I want to say is just that it's important who does restorative justice and practices. And we had this funny experience when we did training. We just believe very much that you got to get the people kind of who are in the hood, from the hood, to just do it. But we had this awesome experience where when we do the trainings, when we did our 4-day training, and it starts out with circle practice, and we're doing stuff like, what kind of, if you were a body of water, what would you be? If you were a waterfall, and we're playing with pieces of wood and doing all these things, and so we got a whole bunch of people, and they, it's mostly, young adults of color who've been locked up, and over the first day or a day and a half, they're kind of going, man, this is some real white hippie, bohemian, this isn't stuff that works in the hood. And then you kind of go deeper and you kind of start, and then people start saying, oh, you know what? This is actually just how we handle problems in the hood when you don't get the police involved. And there's this sense of like, this is a way to live. And so I think it's real important to infuse that at the community level. One thing I'll just say I'm really excited about, Anna Bermudez has made it possible. There's a new initiative that's going to be happening as part of the mayor's gun violence prevention thing where we're going to be doing this credible messenger mentoring thing in 15 NYCHA developments where there's been a lot of gun violence. And we just said, you know what would be a great way to do this program? Because it's mentoring and it's cognitive behavioral, but we said we could kind of make it up as we go, right? And we said, well, what if we trained all 45 of the mentors who are mostly formerly incarcerated individuals from the communities? What if before the program even started, we put them through like a 4-day restorative practices, restorative conferencing thing so that they were infused with being peacemakers and being, and we're gonna have Cheryl Graves come out from Chicago. Ashley Ellis is here, who's one of her mentees and has helped with our training. But I really believe that it's a lot about what we invest in. And I think we've been in this point of time in New York where we've had this logic that we believe that if we don't invest millions and billions in this criminal justice apparatus, right, all hell will break loose. If the police aren't enforcing broken windows, it's going to be the purge, right? If we don't, and you see the last 3 weeks, the police have basically stopped doing their job, and we're okay. But it's also an opportunity to say, well, where are we going to put our money and what are we going to invest in? And I think that if we invest in infusing restorative practices at the community level throughout the city, then we can solve problems of crime and violence and all of these stuff that really make people's lives miserable without this whole damn justice system. And I'll leave it at that.
Hi, good evening. I'm Susan Gutz from the Osborne Association, and the Osborne Association is, I was going to say, a mid to large-sized criminal justice service agency. We serve people of all ages at all levels of criminal justice involvement in the community, in the courts, on Rikers, upstate, coming home, and their family members. We would like to say we have thoroughly infused restorative justice into every little bitty bit of everything we do, but that's still a goal of ours. But we do have a particular program that I'm going to talk with you about tonight that is focused on restorative justice principles. It's called the Long-Term Responsibility Project. And we are serving people in state prisons who are serving long, mostly sentences of life on the back for homicide-related offenses. We began this work in 2007 when really just out of pure sort of selfish reasons. We had all these great folks we were working with in prison. They were developing programs, they were opening and running our children's visiting centers, they were running the college programs, they were doing all these things, and they could not get out. They had 3 master's degrees and letters from this person and that person, and they went to parole over and over and over again, and weren't getting out. And we needed them out here. So we thought, well, you know, what's going on? Surely it can't be simply because the system is just unfair and broken. That would be crazy. Maybe there's something going on, or maybe there's something we can do to improve people's chances. Let's look at what's happening. Because, you know, they've got all the pieces of paper that say they should go home. So we started, you know, talking to folks, looking at people's transcripts who were stuck in and who had gotten out, and looking at differences there. And we were seeing that the folks who were not getting out were explaining their crimes with phrases like, the gun went off and then he died. And I mean, if that's what happened, then it's like, that gun should be in prison. You should probably be out. That sounds, you know, that's a mix-up there. So we really sort of thought about that, and well, how are these like incredibly educated, sensitive, you know, friends of ours saying that in a parole hearing when we know them to be so different? And then we looked at the criminal justice system, and the answer became really clear. When you're arrested, your lawyer says, don't say anything, right? You might go to trial and say nothing, or you might go to trial and lie and say, it wasn't me, or I was there, but I was the lookout, it was really this guy or this girl over here. And then you go to prison, and you either say nothing about your crime, you tell another lie about your crime, or you sort of tell the truth about your crime, but you use it to scare people, maybe. So, and then, like 20 or 30 years later, you're supposed to go into the parole hearing enlightened, fully understanding the course of your life and every detail of what you did and why you did it, and explain why you'll never do that thing again. And we knew that the people that we were working with were not going to do that thing again, not only because we knew them, but because the statistics in New York State show that people, you know, convicted of homicide who were released had a return rate of, I think, for men 1%, for women less than 1%, and those were for technical parole violations, not for new crimes. But still, they weren't getting out. So we started working with people through a restorative justice practice. We were working with them on an individual basis, matching them with a 3-person team. One was a restorative justice practitioner, the other was a case manager to kind of gather all the pieces of paper, put the full packet, the discharge plan together, and then the other was an attorney. And we're so fortunate to have pro bono representation for all these participants, from Paul Weiss, Ruth Gay Martin, Garrison, so what we do in the course of this work with people is we start kind of at the beginning, if they allow us. So a lot of folks in prison, murder is so aberrational, right? Like, there's so few people that are in prison because they just can't stop killing people. It's like something happened, right? And it takes quite a bit of work and reflection to really understand what it is that happened. One, because of the criminal justice process, sort of just mentioned, but the other because it's really painful to accept that responsibility for killing someone. And most of us, sort of our brains work to keep us alive in all kinds of ways, to keep the heart beating and to keep us from just sort of dying of our own shame, right? And so people work very hard psychologically to survive prison, to survive the truth of their crime. And it's very hard to be vulnerable in that situation. So we help people connect the dots of their life through individual sessions, really focused on, sort of looking at turning points. Where did things happen? What was going right? What was going wrong? And how did this culminate? And not just stopping there, because we saw our folks as the whole people that they were, but we also wanted to prepare them to show the parole board the whole people that we were. So how, what was the life course that led up to the crime? What happened in the crime? What did you do? Then what happened next? What happened? All the details, right? And then what's happened since then? Tell us about your transformation. Because not only were we seeing in transcripts the gun went off and then he died, but we were saying, oh, that wasn't me, I'm not like that, I'm different now. Well, that kind of sounds like just what anybody might say to get out of trouble, and it doesn't show a lot of insight. And we've had very good success. So we saw people not only going into the parole board and getting released, sometimes with us on the first time appearing for the parole board, or sometimes on the 10th or 11th time appearing before the parole board, changing their stories, right? I was the lookout, actually I was the shooter, and we helped people negotiate that. But we really saw the freedom and the lift that it brought to them as people who spent just about every waking moment in prison currently trying to make up for this terrible thing that they had done without maybe ever telling their mother the truth or themselves the truth. And so they were able to have these conversations and really able to come home in a way positioned much better to have immediate success rather than kind of struggle for quite a bit and then have success. So because this was so great, but so incredibly labor intensive and so hard to fund, believe it or not, people don't want to fund helping people who kill people get out of prison. We decided to provide this service in a group setting so we could serve more than one person at a time. And also we really saw the value of the restorative work in itself and decided to not fully disconnect it from parole because it has value there, but to not have an upcoming parole year requirement for participation. We thought, why are we only limiting this to people who've already been in prison for 25 years? Let's get the person who's 5 years in and the rest of their incarceration could be, their time could be done with this level of understanding. And so we, two of our just wonderful volunteers, sometimes consultants if we have money to pay them, Kathy Boudin, who herself spent significant amount of time in prison for a homicide-related offense, and Corey Chertoff, who is a restorative justice practitioner and a crime survivor, came together and wrote this wonderful curriculum that we call Coming to Terms, that we have been providing in a group setting for about 3 years now. We've done a few groups at Sing Sing, and some at Fishkill. Actually, Corey's at Fishkill today, screening folks for our next group. And we've just had a tremendous feedback from the participants. We have just enjoyed the experience so much. It does seem like the way things should work when you just do things the way they're supposed to be done. And for us as a criminal justice service agency, who I think for a very long time saw ourselves as being on one side of the fence, this work has sort of rung a bell for us that cannot be unrung. And I think it has really allowed us to have a much more balanced and just right approach to criminal justice, to our work with individuals, to our expectation and belief that people really can take accountability, they really can take responsibility, they can articulate remorse and understand what happened. And once people really have that understanding of their behavior, the likelihood that it's going to happen again, like everyone else on the panel said, is just so diminished, and it's worth all the effort. So that's long term. I will just tell you one little tiny bit story. There's as an example, one of our participants robbed a taxi driver. He was in the back seat and sort of pulled a gun on the driver and said, "Give me your money," and the driver fought back by driving erratically and tossing our participant around in the back seat of the car. And at his first hearing, he couldn't stop saying he was sorry. It was clear from the transcript that he was crying the entire hearing. But he said in the hearing, if only he wouldn't have fought back. Right? And that's where he was. He felt bad. He really did. He was wrong, he felt wrong, that was as deep as he could go on his own. And during part of this, one of the most painful moments, I think, for him in working with us is when I get emotional, but when he thought about all of the taxi drivers and their families who saw that on the news the next morning and then went out to work. They were terrified, fathers and wives and children. And that's what he said at his next hearing, and he really meant it. And he's out, he's serving people as a case manager in a service organization. And I think lives every day to get back.